For regular videos on ancient cultures and forgotten civilizations, please subscribe. If you would like to support the channel and become part of our ancient history fan community, visit patreon.com/World of Antiquity. Today we're going to be looking at video content about ancient high technology. For those of you who are new to alternative ancient history, this is a reference to an idea promoted in some circles, and quite popular here on YouTube, that a global high-tech civilization existed back in the Stone Age. In the interest of full disclosure, I do not subscribe to such a view, but I am open to new ideas and am willing to give any argument due consideration. In this series, I have generally responded to the most popular of the alternative history vids, but I have gotten several requests recently that I should be looking at the videos of the UnchartedX channel. The channel is still of modest size, and the proprietor's videos don't have as many views as some other channels, but I've been told that on it I can find particularly strong arguments and some of the most convincing evidences for a global high-tech civilization in the Stone Age. So I decided to take a look. Maybe I've been going for easy pickings and should be engaging with the best material, rather than merely the most viewed. So, here we go. Ben Van Kerkwyk is a YouTuber, originally from Australia, I believe, now living in the US, who hosts the UnchartedX channel, as well as a website, UnchartedX.com. He travels to other countries seeking out evidence of lost technology. I have to say, his videos contain some very high-quality shots of ancient ruins and artifacts. Kudos to him for bringing many of these ancient sites to life for the viewer. Later this year, he's planning to take a tour to Egypt to describe what he finds there in accordance with his own theories. From what I know about him, I expect he's planning to bypass the tour guides on site. Ben did a two-part video series on the evidence for ancient high technology that many have been saying is very convincing. So let's take a look at these videos together and see what Ben has to say. They're long, so I can't include every last minute of them. I just have to focus on the main points. Just so you know I'm not taking anything he says out of context, I will leave a link to his video below, so you can double check. When I wrote my response, even for just his first video, it ended up being way too long. So I've decided, mainly so as not to smother you with a mammoth 2-hour-long video essay, to break my response to his first video into 2 videos. This one will deal with UnchartedX's introduction to the subject. Yeah, it will take me a whole video just to respond to that. My next video will deal with his actual evidence. So, let's listen to his introduction.
In this video, I want to share with you some of my favorite examples of the evidence for ancient forms of high technology. From the machining marks and construction techniques used in megalithic construction, to the measurable precision and symmetry of ancient artifacts, big and small.
I was hoping he would have said best examples instead of favorite examples, but favorite will have to do. He summarizes well what his argument will be. To reiterate, he will be looking at 2 sources of evidence. First, as he says, machining marks and construction techniques used in megalithic construction. Actually, in this video, I couldn't find much discussion of construction techniques, but he does spend time on machining marks. And keep in mind, he means machining marks made by machines that, he says, the ancient Egyptians did not possess. His second source of evidence is measurable precision and symmetry of ancient artifacts, big and small. He saves most of the precision discussion for his second video, which we will get to another time. In this one, he touches on some symmetry, though he doesn't provide any measurements, despite his emphasis on the word measurable. Well, he does suggest one measurement, but it seems to be an estimation. We'll get to it.
These enduring mysteries are difficult to explain from within our orthodox view of human history. Often wrought from the very hardest forms of natural stone, these objects and the techniques used to make them represent a class of out-of-place artifacts that seems far beyond the known capabilities and the tools of the ancient civilizations we attribute them to.
UnchartedX claims these mysteries, as he calls them, are difficult to explain, but my research has turned up no significant difficulties. I do wonder if he actually asked archaeologists and they said, "Oh, it's difficult to explain." Or if he read a bunch of archaeological reports that said, these marks on the stones are difficult to explain. Probably not. I think maybe he means merely that he doesn't accept their explanations. That's not the same as being difficult to explain. When he refers to a class of out-of-place artifacts that are far beyond the known capabilities and tools of the ancient civilizations we attribute them to, he does not, nor does he ever in this video, tell us what ancient civilization they actually come from. This gives him an advantage because it will allow him to critique the attributions made by others, but will not allow others to critique any attribution of his own. He doesn't attribute these artifacts to any known society, culture, or group of people, so he gives us no positive argument to assess. All we can really do is assess his negative argument, that is, the argument that certain artifacts were not made by the civilizations in whose country these artifacts are found. Oh, and note also his use of the word orthodox to describe the mainstream view of history. The word, as you may know, comes from religious terminology and means literally correct teaching, but Ben doesn't think it's correct. It calls to mind the church and its dogma. This is a rhetorical device meant to instill in you, the viewer, a negative view of mainstream history, especially for those with a Protestant mindset.
These astonishing precision objects undeniably come to us from the distant past. They are found on ancient sites, yet often they seem far superior to the work that's around them, the cruder and far less precise signature common to so many Bronze Age or primitive civilizations.
I find this statement fascinating. Normally, because we see technology progress over time, we attribute more technologically advanced objects to later periods of time, right? And less technologically advanced objects to earlier periods of time. Yet he says these astonishing precision objects undeniably come to us from the distant past. Seems backwards, doesn't it? But maybe he has a good reason. I'm curious how he decides on the age of artifacts. Now, the reason that he gives for knowing that these objects are from the distant past is they're found on ancient sites. But do you see the issue with that? Let's say a fellow makes an imitation Egyptian artifact, a figurine of some kind, and takes it to Giza and drops it on the ground when no one's looking. Now, would an archaeologist go by and see it there and say, wow, an ancient artifact? I mean, I obviously know it's ancient because it's here in this ancient site with all these other ancient things. No, that would be foolish of him to do that. I don't know if Ben will watch this video. It would be great if he did and we could get a discussion going. Just in case, I'm going to ask Ben some questions throughout this video to get some clarification, and which he can answer if he ever decides to do a video response. So here's my first question. Ben, what is the method by which you come to the conclusion that these objects are undeniably from the distant past, rather than from a later period of time? How do you tell the difference between something 500 years old, 1,000 years old, 2,000 years old, 5,000 years old, 10,000 years old? The more specific you can be, the better.
Did these same civilizations also possess some form of unknown advanced capability, or the advanced tools required to make such objects?
Before we go on, I think I need to ask Ben another question. He uses the word advanced quite a bit, which is a word that has no clear meaning without a reference. It's kind of like using the word big or the word fast. They're subjective unless you tell us what they are big or fast in comparison with. When he says advanced, I assume he means more advanced than the specific ancient civilization from a specific time period that's under discussion. But sometimes he seems to be implying that he means more advanced than our own present-day civilization. Yet he often isn't clear about that. So my next question for Ben is, when you say advanced, do you mean only more advanced than ancient Bronze Age culture? Or do you mean more advanced than several other cultures? Or do you mean more advanced than all cultures up to the present? And do you always use the word the same way? Clarification would be helpful.
Did these same civilizations also possess some form of unknown advanced capability, or the advanced tools required to make such objects? I suppose it's possible, But there is an utter lack of evidence for any such tools in the archaeological record, nor any record of them in these civilizations' own histories.
Here he says that when we look at the archaeological record of the tools, and do not find the tools that would be necessary to make the marks that we find on various stones, that injures the hypothesis that the known ancient civilizations made the marks. In other words, if we can't find advanced machine tools in the Egyptian archaeological record, that should make us question whether the Egyptians made these marks on the stones. But if that's the case, wouldn't that be equally harmful to his own hypothesis? After all, the tools that he believes made the marks aren't in the archaeological record ever or anywhere.
Is it possible that these objects are far older and that the history of civilization on this planet is longer than we ever believed? Could the ancients, at least as we know them, have inherited some of these artifacts and architecture? Could they have found them to be sacred, incorporated them into their cultures, and used them for ritual or for ceremony? After all, our own modern civilization has inherited the very same objects, and we still find them to be sacred. We still use them for ceremony, even today.
I'm glad that he poses this as a question rather than stating it as a fact. I certainly don't see a problem with the general idea of a culture borrowing something left by an earlier culture. I don't see an issue either with people considering older objects to be special or sacred in some way. However, the time period that UnchartedX wants to place these advanced artifacts is an extremely remote past. Elsewhere, he indicates a period prior to the Younger Dryas, 11 to 12,000 years ago. Just to put that in perspective, the first cities do not appear in the archaeological record until after 6,000 years ago. Double that, and that is where we find UnchartedX's proposed civilization. More than twice the time from the ancient Sumerians to us.
The technology that's evident in this type of stonework is generally dismissed as mostly irrelevant by mainstream archaeology, yet it's frequently found to be utterly remarkable by anyone with an open mind and the will to apply a basic analysis of the engineering principles that must have been used in their construction.
The expression open mind commonly means a willingness to consider other ideas without prejudice. I approach Ben's evidence in such a way, giving his arguments full consideration, even steel-manning them, when he may not have presented them as convincingly as he could, because every argument should be considered in its strongest form. I'm hoping Ben will show an open mind too as he considers my responses to his video. Will he dig in his heels and defend his current view to the last breath? Or will he seriously examine the evidence and think through the arguments I present here and be willing to consider the possibility that what I'm saying may have some merit?
Many researchers and experts from the past couple of centuries have done just this, and they often report being utterly awestruck by these ancient accomplishments and left wondering just how Bronze Age or other relatively primitive cultures managed such feats. From the luminary Sir Flinders Petrie in the 1800s, one of the very first to apply engineering principles to the evidence for precision stonework in ancient Egypt, to a long list of modern engineers like Christopher Dunn, stonemasons like Yusuf Aoun, architects like Randall Carlson, and many other researchers, all with expert understanding of construction techniques.
When Ben says experts, I at first wondered what kind of experts he was referring to. He mainly seems to be referring to engineering experts rather than archaeological experts or historical experts. He does mention here one archaeologist, Sir Flinders Petrie, who lived more than 100 years ago. Considering that our knowledge of the past increases over time as more archaeological evidence is uncovered and scientific analysis of archaeological remains improves, it's interesting that he goes back to super old works of scholarship to support his position. So my next question for Ben is, why? Why look to the expertise of century-old scholars who had far less information than we do today? Now my guess, but please correct me if I'm wrong, is because you hold a prejudice against modern scholars under the notion that they are biased. Is that correct? By the way, for the viewer who doesn't know, Sir Flinders Petrie never subscribed to the idea that Bronze Age Egyptian culture was incapable of creating the architecture that we see. He marveled at it, He hypothesized about it, he admitted a lack of knowledge about how certain things were accomplished, but hey, modern archaeologists do that too.
They all find it very difficult to reconcile these achievements with the known capability of the ancient cultures our academics insist created them. Their findings support the idea that these could well be in fact out-of-place objects, and that they require a level of technology that is far beyond that of the cultures that we attribute them to.
One thing that Ben does not do in this video, and I think it is wise on his part, is talk about the size or weight of stones as evidence of lost high technology. This is something you will see other alternative researchers do. Small items are not, in their opinion, much of any interest. You may find that surprising since we are used to inventions getting smaller as technology improves. Not so here, bigger's better. Hence the love for the term megaliths. The word megalith, which is basically just a cool sounding term for a large stone, is to many a chief identifier of advanced civilization. A small stone, you see, can be used by anybody. But they think that if the stone is large enough, you can make the argument that it is too heavy to be moved and too unwieldy to be shaped by a culture with limited technology. The problem with that argument is that there isn't a single stone made and moved by human hands that needed modern technology to move. Not a one, at least if you believe in physics. Math doesn't lie. Ben, smartly, instead is going to focus on the manner in which the stones have been cut and shaped. He will even point to some smaller objects as evidence of high technology. I find that refreshing. And when I first watched this, I was very interested in what he and the engineer, stonemason, and architect he refers to had to say.
Along with my own observations, my own travels, it is on this basis, on the opinion of a long list of qualified experts, and not those of mainstream archaeology or anthropology, that I too believe this category of stonework to be evidence for unknown and ancient forms of high technology. On topics like precision engineering, tool-making, and large-scale construction, it's these people we should turn to for truly expert opinion, rather than those of tenured academics who write textbooks about the people, practices, traditions, and the daily life of ancient cultures.
Okay, a little red flag pops up here. I am a bit wary of putting full faith into the opinion of modern engineers about ancient tech. Now, as I said, I definitely see value in getting their assessments because many engineering principles are timeless. I'm sure they have some insights to offer, which can be added to the expertise we gather from others. This is, after all, an interdisciplinary investigation, but relying exclusively on the testimony of modern builders, or almost exclusively, can result in some untrustworthy conclusions. I say that because of my awareness of what we call the historian's fallacy. Have you ever heard of it? It's a fallacy in reasoning that historians have learned to beware of. The historian's fallacy is committed when someone judges the past according to present standards. It's a cognitive bias that we all have, and we all need to keep in check. Now, this fallacy can be committed a number of ways, but in this case, we have people accustomed to modern methods of construction, and they are assessing how ancients did construction. When that is done without the accompaniment of knowledge about the times being examined, and without knowledge of how the ancients did things and thought about things, faulty conclusions can be reached. We will continue, nevertheless, to give due consideration to the perspective of these modern builders. Studies of Egyptian engineering from the point of view of modern engineers that I have found valuable are those of Dennis Stocks, a mechanical engineer. His book, Stoneworking Technology in Ancient Egypt, is quite informative. Another engineer, Galal Ali Hassan, has done a whole series of articles called Mechanical Engineering in Ancient Egypt. I think there's like over 50 articles in his series. Part 12 is on stone cutting. I can leave some links in the description below the video.
Archaeologists don't tend to write books about precision engineering, and it by no means degrades the profession by saying that many of its members generally have only a limited interest and certainly no professional expertise in construction technologies.
UnchartedX seems to be unaware of the extensive research that has been done in the subject area by academics. I think you might benefit from some book and article recommendations, which I will provide in the description below this video. For each ancient culture, there are dozens of books and hundreds of articles. Some of the full-length treatments for ancient Egypt include Ancient Egyptian Construction and Architecture. This is one of the early comprehensive studies back in 1930s by Summers Clark and Reginald Engelbach. We've got Building in Egypt, Pharaonic Stone Masonry by Dieter Arnold. More recently, Architecture and Mathematics in Ancient Egypt by Corinna Rossi. The Stones of the Pyramids by Dietrich and Rosemary Clem. Ancient Egyptian Technology and Innovation by Ian Shaw. Old Kingdom Copper Tools and Model Tools by Martin Odler. Quarryscapes, Ancient Stone Quarry Landscapes in the Eastern Mediterranean by Nizar Abu Jaber, Elizabeth Bloxham, Patrick de Grijs, and Tom Heldahl. And all kinds of articles too. I will leave links to as many of these as I can find in the description below this video. But I ask you honestly, does this sound like archaeologists have limited interest in the subject? And no reasonable person who reads these works, even if they disagree with some of the conclusions, would say the authors have no professional expertise in ancient construction technologies. So I'm going to assume that Ben just didn't know about many of these.
Even when the engineering or technological aspects of objects are addressed by mainstream archaeology, it's always cast in the light of the known capability of ancient civilizations, often leading to circular logic that goes nowhere. Something like this, an example. The Old Kingdom granite monoliths like columns and boxes must have been made by copper chisels and pounding stones, because that's what we know that they had. There's no proof they did it any differently.
Let's just stop there for a moment. Archaeologists find artifacts that are located in a certain geographic region, and various indicators such as carbon dating, stratigraphy, sequence dating, seriation dating, luminescence dating, accompanying inscriptions, etc., are that the artifacts come from a certain time period. Is it unreasonable to conclude that the artifact was created by the people of that time and of that place? That should be the default position. Ben says it's circular reasoning. But when you have various independent confirmations of the artifact's provenance, that's not circular. Now let me give you another example. Let's say someone finds an artifact and says that its provenance should be ignored, and we should attribute the manufacture of that artifact to a culture whose independent existence has never been shown. It has no known homeland, no identifiable people, no known origin, none of its tools or wares have been found. And when you ask them for proof, they say that the artifact that they just found is the proof. Their proof that the artifact should be divorced from its context is the presumed existence of this fabulous culture. And the proof that this fabulous culture existed is the artifact. That sounds like circular reasoning. Am I wrong? I don't think so. If I am, tell me how.
Meanwhile, analysis of the objects themselves and the technology needed to make them is direct evidence for such an advanced capability. After all, we have the objects, which is the result of the tools, and we have the markings, which is the signature from the tools. Yet this evidence is dismissed because there have been no tools found. Therefore, the Egyptians must have made them with copper chisels and pounding stones, because that's what we know that they had. It's a circular argument, and it's a neat way of avoiding addressing the actual evidence for precision and high technology in these ancient objects. Just ask, where are the tools, and walk away. Never mind the quantifiable proof that we have of their use that is represented by the objects themselves.
He's very dismissive of the fact that the tools, which he presumes existed, have never been found. He acts as if archaeologists should assume the existence of things that have never been found, and it is a failing on their part if they don't. So my next question for Ben is this. Do you think it is worse for academics to assume that things existed without evidence, or to assume things did not exist until evidence is found? Which is the lesser of the two evils? I think I know what you're going to say. You'll probably say, it's worse for them to assume that things existed without evidence, but in this case, there is evidence. We'll see as we continue. Oh, and let me add this. Let's say ancient power tools were actually found. Would this automatically mean that Ben's claims are correct? In other words, that these tools belong to a global high-tech society that existed in the Stone Age? Of course not. It would depend on where the tools were found and in what context.
This is why archaeologists rarely consider the manufacturing of such precision objects, because the answers risk upsetting the status quo of the story of history.
Wait, I'm not invested in the status quo, and I'm not convinced. How do you explain that? If person A can't convince person B, whose fault is it? Ben seems to think it's person B's fault. Whenever I'm trying to make an argument, and the other person isn't convinced or doesn't understand, my first reaction is to say to myself, how can I explain this better? Because it's probably my doing. And here's another point that needs to be made. Most scholars dream of upsetting the status quo. Oh man, if you as a scholar can make an argument or a discovery that would change the general opinion or revolutionize the field, that would be the ultimate. And you know what? In journals and books, you will find academics trying to do that all the time. Only someone unfamiliar with academia would ever make the claim that academics are afraid to upset the status quo. If you're a scholar and are trying to get published, your work will never appear in a peer-reviewed journal if you simply repeat what others have said. You need to come up with new and original ideas or you don't get published. I mean, state-of-the-field projects, surveys of what has already been done, have their place too, in textbooks for example, but you ain't nobody if you don't make original contributions. That's hammered into your head from the very beginning.
If you're asking about the analysis of the inside of the vases, we only dealt with the contents. We haven't worked on the techniques used to make the vases.
Oh boy, this excerpt of an interview is taken completely out of context. Let's be careful about accusing UnchartedX for doing this on purpose. He pulled this from Jacques Grimaud's documentary, Revelation of the Pyramids. Dr. Andrew Lanois, who you see in the video, is referring only to the specific project that she and her team at the Louvre worked on. They specifically didn't study the techniques. That was not the purpose of the project. The way Ben has spliced it into his video, he makes it sound as if she's talking about the archaeological field as a whole. She's not. Revelation of the Pyramids does acknowledge that Dr. Andrew Lanois is referring to her project specifically. But then after she says, "We haven't worked on the techniques," the narrator adds, "Neither them nor anybody else," which is a blatant lie. Maybe that's how UnchartedX got the wrong impression.
If the Old Kingdom Egyptians didn't have the capability to actually do this work, then who did? And when? Many mainstream archaeologists and anthropologists are deeply vested in maintaining this story of history. They derive their academic power and authority as the experts on this story and of all of its aspects. The motive to protect it and to resist change is somewhat understandable, if admittedly frustrating at times. After all, resisting change and maintaining the status quo is the very nature of establishment.
I would like Ben to explain how academics supposedly derive power from the current mainstream version of history. Does he believe that if academics taught another version of history, their academic power would be diminished? I don't understand how. It doesn't matter what version of history you teach, you're still the teacher.
Before we get into the specifics and examples, I want to set up a little bit of context, as there are certainly a lot of interpretations of just what ancient high technology could mean, and statements or terms like this get thrown around quite a lot. In my case, it's pretty specific. I'm talking about the evidence for technology that is not explainable by the tools found in the archaeological record, nor is it explainable by what we know of the capabilities of ancient civilizations.
So, this is UnchartedX's thesis. I'm glad he's upfront about it and clear, especially since terms like high and advanced are relative.
I'm not talking about lasers or spacecraft or mystical energies and crystals. I'm talking about the verifiable and measurable evidence of advanced tooling and machining of very hard types of stone, and the advanced construction methodologies that must have been used in the creation of various forms of ancient megalithic architecture or artifacts.
He uses the words verifiable and measurable. Yet in his 45-minute video, no exact measurements are provided. And he never really defines hard types of stone either. There's a scale, the Mohs scale, which measures hardness, but he never tells us what hardness measurement range we're talking about. So we're just kind of left to guess or go look it up, which is strange if measurability is so crucial to your argument.
This evidence isn't in every part of ancient civilizations, in fact, far from it.
If that's the case, then why do alternative researchers go around to almost every civilization pointing to high technology? The only ones they tend to avoid are the European ones. Seems like no matter what archaeological site Brian Forster visits, he always finds evidence of ancient high technology. And here's another question for Ben. Why is evidence of this advanced technology only found within other civilizations? Why are there no evidences outside of them? I mean, I fully acknowledge the possibility of new civilizations building on the remains of older ones. Sometimes. But there are bound to be cases where cities of this earlier civilization were abandoned and no one went back. Where are those? Isn't it a little suspicious that alternative historians can find evidence pretty much only in other people's civilizations?
And one of the distinguishing factors that I'll illustrate in this video is exactly this point, that quite often this evidence, all these objects, stand out in stark contrast to the relatively primitive levels of technology in the ancient work that's around them, or even on them, as is the case for much of the hieroglyphs that have been badly scratched into precision-made objects like the boxes and statues from ancient Egypt.
Ben's going to provide examples from locations in Egypt, Abu Sir, Giza, Abu Rawash, the Serapeum in Saqqara, as well as some objects in the Egyptian Museum.
I also want to state why I think this set of evidence is important, as it goes against the narrative of the development of civilization as we know it. It's an important part of framing the wider argument, that for a re-evaluation of the roots of human civilization, with the idea that we've both risen high and been struck down by catastrophe before. I've got specific videos on several of the other aspects to this argument, things like the Younger Dryas cataclysm, the extension of the human timeline, or even what the ancients themselves said about their own origins.
Okay, so I made this rough chart here, showing the level of technology through the ages according to the archaeological record. Okay? Now, what UnchartedX is suggesting is that we take some of the evidence for technology from these periods over here and we pile them up way back here 10 or 11,000 years ago. Not only that, but we have to infer an even greater technology than what we found. So we reconstruct an even more advanced technology for that period to make it even more drastic. Of course, I acknowledge that even in the case of mainstream archaeologists, there's a certain amount of reconstruction of technology going on, but they don't infer that much from that little evidence. How realistic does this look to you? Now, he explains the drop from the high to the low in terms of a catastrophe, but that doesn't explain how the tech got there in the first place, right? Where is the growth of technology up to that point? I guess it's all destroyed. So we have to infer even more. And also, what about all the existing low tech all around it? These are some of the problematic elements of this proposed outline of history that really need to be explained.
Both the ancient Egyptians and Sumerians trace their civilizations back tens of thousands of years further than we give them credit for, and you would be hard-pressed to find any ancient culture that didn't have fire, flood, or cataclysm myths in their own origin stories. Events that their advanced gods or ancestors barely lived through, and because of them were forced to restart civilization again.
Well, there are thousands of myths out there. You can find in them pretty much whatever you want to find. But yeah, many ancient civilizations competed with each other for antiquity. The older you were, the more superior you felt to the others. That's why they kept trying to outdo each other in age by creating these myths. Do you know that when they translated the Bible, the Hebrew Bible, from Hebrew into Greek, the translators increased the chronology of the pre-flood period, and the post-flood period for that matter, to push their history back further? Yeah. This is something that people did. Natural disasters are a favorite subject of myths. That's to be expected since myths try to explain the reasons for them. And the favorite explanation is that the gods cause disasters as punishments upon humans. One thing you will find is that these natural disasters are not, in the myths of the various countries, described as occurring at the same time in history. Have you ever heard of euhemerism? I have a full article on the subject on my website. Basically, it's the interpreting of myth as if it were history, or at least based on history. You might say, but wait, I thought myths are known to be fictional. Ah, the euhemerist doesn't think so. Those who believe in ancient lost civilizations are frequently found to be euhemerists, because lacking evidence in historical documents, they appeal to myths for evidence of their lost civilization. But I, and I'm sure many of you, see issues with this approach to myth, because not only does it disregard the origins of the genre, but more importantly, it is highly subjective, since it allows a person to pick and choose whatever part of myth they want to be true. There is no method for interpretation.
Modern science is validating the evidence for catastrophism and the grains of truth that are contained in these stories. Catastrophism is now part of mainstream Earth science, but its impact has not yet been truly felt when it comes to the cultural implications and the soft sciences of history or archaeology.
A catastrophe is, on the surface, a decent explanation for why the evidence for this global high-tech society is so scanty. But what nags me about it is how unusual, how unnatural this catastrophe is. Specifically, I mean what it preserved and what it destroyed. It preserved, almost exclusively, stone blocks used in building or in art. Nothing else remains of its great technology. No fragments of any of the power systems, computing systems, recording systems or records, vehicles and transports, devices of any kind, or for that matter, no independent city ruins, no residences, no remains of the people themselves, no wares, no implements. And yet for that same period of time, the time right before this catastrophe, we do find people and wares and implements and tools, but just the primitive ones. Are we to understand that this catastrophe wiped out all the more durable, superior tools of this ancient culture and preserved the weaker, more inferior ones? Thousands of inferior tools and 0 superior ones. What would you say the odds of that would be? And it destroyed all the people with knowledge and preserved only the ignorant people. I mean, that's one magic cataclysm. Normally, when I think of a catastrophe, I think of chaos, randomness, and yet here we have what appears to be selectivity. That's unnatural. Certainly not the product of a comet impact, for example.
I think this evidence for ancient high technology is a vital piece of the overall argument for a re-evaluation of human history and our origins. And to me, it's an indicator for a past that is both longer and far more complex than the one we generally accept. You know, the one that says human civilization only really began around 6,000 years ago. Even saying that at this point sounds a little bit ridiculous to me, but that is indeed still the orthodox position.
Not everyone uses the word civilization in the same way, and that is why archaeologists and historians have tended to avoid the term as of late. But the technical definition of civilization is urban society. I have seen people use the word simply to refer to any society, urban or not. But the point is, when historians say that civilization began 6,000 years ago, they mean the first evidence of cities in the archaeological record come from that time and are found in southern Mesopotamia. I think even Ben would have to admit that his evidence, which he thinks points to superior tools, does not necessarily constitute evidence of high population centers. In fact, his tools would require fewer people to build something. So why is it surprising that archaeologists and historians would be saying that cities began 6,000 years ago when there are no cities that have ever been found that date before then? Can he name a city that we've discovered that is older than 6,000 years? I don't know of any.
Without derailing this video, I do want to make a point here, as I'm sure some of you might be thinking, hang on, hasn't the discovery and dating of Göbekli Tepe with its 11,000-year-old radiocarbon dating and deliberate burial, hasn't this pushed back the date for human civilization? You would think so, and I and many others certainly think so, but if you follow the mainstream debate, such as it is, or if you look up the entry for Göbekli Tepe on that bastion of establishment groupthink that is Wikipedia, you'll find that the site is still attributed to Neolithic hunter-gatherer cultures.
He does derail the video for 9 minutes, and most of it is a rant against archaeologists. I'm going to skip ahead to where he actually gets to the evidence, but first I do want to address a few things he says about Göbekli Tepe.
Mainstream archaeology, you see, rather than risk being wrong about their precious story of history, a story from which derives all of their academic authority and tenure, simply changed their definition of what it means to be a hunter-gatherer. As if one of the largest megalithic sites in the world, with hundreds of expertly made pillars and stone circles, with individual pillars ranging from 10 to 50 tons in weight, as if all of this was made by nomadic tribes of loincloth-wearing savages as some sort of weekend hobby. You know, the boys get together, go camping, get away from the kids, do a bit of rock carving, that type of thing. It's ridiculous.
Ben here is employing the rhetorical strategy of reframing a person's position in the most ridiculous terms. It's effective, but it's just a form of straw manning. Who says that Göbekli Tepe was created by loincloth-wearing savages? Nobody. Who says they did it on a camping trip? No one. So let's set aside the mischaracterizations and stick with what people are actually saying.
The site obviously requires real civilization to have been built. It obviously requires decades of training and expertise for the quarrying, shaping, and the artwork wrought in the stone. It obviously needed a large population base and diversified, organized culture in order to support such activity.
When UnchartedX uses the word civilization here, he doesn't appear to be talking about urban society, but just an organized society with enough people to make the monuments and a division of labor, as he says. On this, everyone agrees. So far, no points of disagreement between him and archaeologists and historians. What else does the material evidence at Göbekli Tepe tell us? The site has several sanctuaries in the form of round stone enclosures. The main features are T-shaped monolithic pillars, each weighing several tons. Some partially preserved skulls with artificial modification have indicated the possible presence of a skull cult, such as seen in other Neolithic sites. So far, no residential buildings have been found, so we can't say, at this point anyway, that it was used for habitation. The other Neolithic sites in the region have their residential areas separated from their specialized workshop areas and from their special ritual and sacred areas. So it would be normal for Göbekli Tepe not to have residences close by. There's no doubt about it. This region has yielded evidence for a degree of social complexity that surprised archaeologists. But one thing that Göbekli Tepe does not show is evidence of an urban society with advanced technology. Ben says the T-shaped pillars were expertly made. I mean, they're pretty unrefined by today's standards, but for the time, yeah, I'm sure they were made by the experts of the day. If his overstating of the refinement of these pillars is getting you a little worried that his forthcoming evidence will not be as impressive as he's leading you to believe, you wouldn't be entirely wrong. But here is where I'm a bit confused. If Ben thinks that Göbekli Tepe came after the cataclysm, and the technology was lost, and the world went back to primitive living after the cataclysm, why does he appear to be arguing for high technology at Göbekli Tepe? Did advanced science survive the catastrophe or not? And if it did survive, was there another cataclysm that destroyed that too? Anyway, there isn't any evidence of machining at Göbekli Tepe, so I suppose the point is moot.
We now know that Göbekli Tepe may have represented something even more important and more profound. Its artwork seems to represent a dating system and might contain a record of the Younger Dryas cataclysm itself, along with other cosmic events of the time. Dr. Martin Sweatman, author of Prehistory Decoded, has discovered a strong link between the artwork at Göbekli Tepe and the alignment of constellations going back in time, including what seems to be a connection to the Younger Dryas comets or cosmic bodies themselves.
So it would appear that Göbekli Tepe is significant to Ben chiefly for its art. The pillars are decorated with varied animal motifs, including foxes, snakes, scorpions, boars, aurochs, gazelles, wild donkeys, and birds, as well as in some cases arms and hands, showing that the sculptures represent stylized, human-like individuals. He claims that some of these images represent a dating system, but since he provides no evidence here of that, I will move on.
I think that the late Klaus Schmidt, who was the director for the excavation at Göbekli Tepe for many years, I think that he knew that this site represented civilization, but he was very cautious to not risk his archaeological career by coming out and challenging the status quo story of history with a direct claim against it. Instead, he said that it represented a transition from hunter-gatherers to an agricultural society, which to my mind is a roundabout way of calling it civilization.
I've read the reports by Klaus Schmidt, and it's not merely that he refrains from calling Göbekli Tepe a civilization, but he states quite clearly that he found no evidence that it was a civilization. Ben claims some knowledge of what Schmidt had going on in his mind. I don't know how that's possible, but knowing that archaeologists define civilization as urban society, and since no city has been uncovered here, how could Schmidt think this is a civilization? There is no doubt that the finds at Göbekli Tepe and nearby sites have rewritten history. Keep in mind that the people who found these remains and who subsequently revised their views were archaeologists. That's what they and historians always do. They make discoveries and rewrite history. Every year, I read about dozens of discoveries that change our view of history. Textbooks are revised every couple of years. It's hard to even keep up. So what problem does Ben have with this? Isn't that what he wants? It sounds to me that the problem for him is not that archaeologists and historians refuse to revise their views, but specifically that they have not accepted Ben's views, or the views of the people that Ben reveres. I sometimes think about how I might respond when theories of my own don't go over well with my peers. That has happened, actually, and it will happen many more times. I've sent out articles for publication in various academic journals and have received rejections and even some scathing critiques. So what do? I do more research to find more convincing arguments and better evidence, revise my work, improving it, and send again. One thing I try to avoid is feeling like I'm persecuted, because I know rationally I'm not. That's my ego feeling like that. Peer review is supposed to work that way. I relish the criticism because it helps me to become stronger. With that in mind, if you have any criticisms of this video, I want to hear about it. Ben goes on for several more minutes ranting about mainstream scholarship, but he finally is ready to present his evidence around the 20-minute mark of his video. But I will save my discussion of his evidence for my follow-up video. This one has gotten long enough. Don't worry, it will be out soon. The evidence is really what we came here for, right? So I look forward to sinking my teeth into it along with you. If you like this kind of content, please smush the like button. And if you haven't subscribed yet, please do. If you also press the bell button, you'll get a notification that part 2 is done and ready to be viewed. Thanks for watching.